Ja, vielen Dank für die Einführung und danke an Sie fürs Dasein und vor allem vielen herzlichen Dank an Jacqueline. Und Jacqueline, ich denke, wir könnten anfangen mit den Anfängen, weil dein Vater hat ja und deine Eltern haben Kunst gesammelt und das hat eigentlich bedeutet, dass du eigentlich nicht hast Künstlerin werden. Könntest du ein bisschen erzählen
Stimmt,
von denen?
ja, so hat es angefangen. Aber dann hat alles sich eben geändert. Und dann haben wir plötzlich, ich haben dann Entschluss genommen, dass ich doch Künstler werde.
Ja.
Und das war zur Erstaunung von allen gewesen. Und dann hat irgendwie der Einfluss ist natürlich wohl gewesen von einer Gruppe von jungen Künstlern aus München. Das ist ein Wort, das sicher versteht ihr.
Spur.
Ja, Spur, genau. Damit hat dann eigentlich der richtig, ja, wenn wir sagen, Wave, Clash, whatever, angefangen und dann bin ich Maler geworden. Und dann bin ich sofort auch eigentlich professioneller Maler geworden. Und ja, was kann man sagen, ich hatte Glück gehabt, dass meine Sachen auch verkauft worden sind und dann davon können leben. Aber dann bin ich nach Paris. Erst habe ich da ein paar Jahre geschafft im Stedelijk Museum.
Dem
das
Sandberg, ja.
Beim Sandberg und das verstehen Sie vielleicht auch noch. Aber jedenfalls hat es überhaupt nichts mit Schweizer oder Schweizerdeutsch zu tun. Es ist weitergegangen eher nach Skandinavien.
Und du hast ja vorher auch noch Tänzerin werden irgendwann. Das ist
ja, aber das ist ganz kurz gewesen. Nein, Schauspielerin.
Schauspielerin.
Ja, und darum sitzen wir hier.
Genau.
Wenn wir eben auch ein Schauspiel machen können.
Das war aber unrealisiert gewesen, das Projekt.
Ja, das war auch in London gewesen, der Guildhall School of Dramatic Art. Aber das ist ein Reinfall geworden in Holland.
Oh wow. Aber du hast da studiert in
ja,
London.
In
welchem Jahr ist es?
Ja.
So we promised to Pippy that we will not do the whole evening in Swiss German. But anyway, this was a prelude, and please give a very, very warm welcome to Jacqueline. It's also, in a way, an homage, to the late Edouard Glissant, the great poet and writer who always said that we need to celebrate multilingualism. And he always organized these wonderful, poetry readings in Paris. I always remember I went to listen to actually Thor Williamson, the old Icelandic poet, and he would come from Reykjavik and read for an hour in Icelandic, and we would just, listen without translation. And so at the moment when, a few months ago, two young people were actually beaten up in a bus in the UK for speaking Spanish and not English. So at that very moment in history, I think it's incredibly important to celebrate multilingualism. So that's why we thought we're going to start with Swiss German. And actually very few people know that Jacqueline speaks Swiss German without an accent. It's extraordinary. How come?
Well, I think I told you when we were sitting opposite each other at this dinner with Beatrix Ruf, and suddenly I said, after all, why do we always speak other languages? Well, I do speak Swiss German for the simple reason that my mother was Swiss. And my grandparents were living in Zurich, and I was very often, during vacations, visiting my grandparents, but also because during the Second World War I fled to Switzerland. And my first 2 years at school were in Zurich. So that's why it's Zurich Swiss. And yours is Basel Swiss?
No, I come from the Lake of Constance, the Bodensee.
Oh yeah, okay, yes. But that's like Beatrix.
Yeah, exactly. It's an hour from Zurich. Okay. But I was born in Zurich. Now it's interesting because you at the beginning didn't want to become an artist. You wanted to become an actress because your parents were collecting art. So you wanted to not go into art. Can you tell us a little bit about these beginnings and then how you studied actually in London, wanted to become an actress? We're now going to repeat what we said before in Swiss German.
Well, when I was working in the Stedelijk Museum in the design department, which was not the art department, I was studying art history, and I got very much involved and very interested in everything that was around what I had to study, etc. But also I met through Oscar Jorn and through a very young German artist Nele, she's called. And she was the daughter of Bode, who started Documenta. I met the Gruppe Spur, and the Gruppe Spur was a German group of young artists from Munich, and they had a big show in Essen, and I went to the show, and I thought, this is what I want, because that really triggered me. They had a spontaneous sort of between, let's say, German expressionism and Dada, a very liberal, very quite crazy way of working, which later was very much like the Frankfurter Schule in art. And well, that made me sort of confident to start being a painter. I was 18 years old, and I thought, well, now I go to academy. I was not accepted at the academy because I was working at the Stedelijk Museum, which was a very leftish sort of ambiance. I don't know what's that called in English. And for political reasons, I was not accepted, so I had to start myself, and which I did with some older artists where I could work. And then I went to Paris to study at Bill Hayter, who had the Atelier 17, and I studied there graphics. At that moment, I really started being a painter, but I was also involved with the International Situationist at the same time, who were going to have a big exhibition in 1960 in the Stedelijk, but that didn't work out for complicated reasons. And instead of that, the same Sandberg you were talking about made his first big show on, well, let's say, bewogen beweging, which was Fluxus, instead of the Situationists. And in a way, I think he was right. I think you agree there too. Historically was right, because the Situationists were not an art movement. They were a movement with artists. And you can't say that any art came out of the Situationist movement.
But it's interesting that you worked at the Stedelijk at that very incredible moment in time, because it's obviously, Harald Seemann always told me it was the most exciting museum in the world in the 50s. It's a real laboratory, and Kladders told me the same thing, and I mean many museum directors of the 60s sort of took what happened in Amsterdam in the 50s as a kind of a role model. And he was, of course, not the museum director. He was a graphic designer, an anarchist. Can you tell us a little bit about your memories of the Stedelijk at that time?
Well, you could say, I mean, as you might know, I had this big show in the Stedelijk just now. So it was very much, the last half year, very much in the Stedelijk, because it lasted a half year. And I discovered in a way that there is very little left of this fantastic mentality which he had then, which is a shame, but on the other hand, it's such another time. What my memory from the Stedelijk was, it was quite small, and Sandberg, not only that he was making these wonderful catalogs with his typography, which was very exceptional, but he had this connection with Pontus Hultén, of the Moderne Museum, and later on, of course, of Pompidou, of Beaubourg. And Pontus Hultén was very involved with the Fluxus people, or with Nicky Saint-Phal and Dangeli, and Sandberg got very much interested and involved in that. And that made also that there was a sort of non-agreement with the Situationists. I mean, in my opinion, it was very clearly that Sandberg made the choice of not having to do with them, and that made that the avant-garde part of the Stedelijk Museum became something which was an avant-garde, which was in fashion, and not this very strong avant-garde he had before, although he made an exhibition of Pinot Galizio and the industrial paintings.
One could buy that by Mieter. It was the
Yes,
Mieter,
exactly. Yeah. And that was very strong. But on the other hand, he chose for the, well, let's say, you can't say fashion, but the cool, if you could say, way of showing avant-garde. and went into, in a way we could say, in a global, at that moment, global situation. So the state became something which was known all over the world, which it was also when the Family of Man, which was the first big photography exhibition ever in Europe.
Which toured all over the world.
Yeah, exactly. So it had this history, but the really dangerous avant-garde got out of it.
And that was, of course, Situationism. And before we talk about your work and the paintings here and the more recent work and what you're doing now and your new projects in the future, I just wanted to ask one more thing about the past and about Situationism, because the central thesis really of Situationism was that art should be diffused into life and life diffused into art. I went to see actually Raoul van Egem, the Belgian Situationist, some years ago, and he talked a lot about that, the idea of life diffused into art and art diffused into life, and that of course connected it also to Dada. I mean, Tristan Tzara said the modern artist does not paint but creates directly. Life and art make one. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that art and life relationship, and it's interesting. I mean, when I spoke to, I think it was Constant, but also mainly Constant, they told me that at a certain moment Debord became so militant against art that he really wanted to somehow get art completely out. And you, of course, you wrote for my Instagram, no art without us, no us without art. So you stick to art as opposed to Debord. But it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about these differences and how you connect art and life. Because you also did magazines. You did your own Situationism in a way.
Yeah, but all that I did when I was excluded, when I was thrown out. I mean, the whole thing was not only Constant, but Constant made his New Babylon, but also Jan got thrown. I mean, everyone got excluded by the Situationists who was making art, and that mainly because of Van Egem, who you mentioned, and Cotani, because they thought art is something which is commercial, which obviously it is, and also the same art which was commercial and had to leave, actually the Coupe Spur, I got thrown out because I was solidary with the Coupe Spur, who got thrown out because they made a magazine which was paid by Paolo Marinotti, and Paolo Marinotti was a big collector, so that means that he was not only a big collector, but a very big industrial person. And that was the reason why Van Egem and Cotani thought Spur has to get out. I disagreed completely because, as I said, and which was reality, without the support of collectors, the whole magazine of the International Situationist couldn't exist, nor the films that were made. I mean, there had to be someone that was able to pay for these productions. And that was mainly Jorn, who sold to the same Marinotti. So I thought there was complete discrepancy between these ideas, of which were social political ideas, of Van Egem and our wish to create and change the world. And we needed, in my opinion, and not only mine, of course, the other artists also, we didn't need financial support from the mécènes, from the collectors that were around. So there is in this aspect, it's in 1962 that it really clashed, because you couldn't have the social political part of the Situationists with their theories together with the possibility of getting further in this utopia. We had to change the world.
And so then you were excluded, and when we were in Amsterdam, we visited you with Kouchonga and Rem Koolhaas and Petra Blaise in your amazing house and studio on many, many floors in Amsterdam. It's a tiny house, but it has many, many floors. And you showed us this amazing magazine you made. So you did your own Situationism. Can you tell us about your magazine and how it differed from?
Well, actually the house changed because, thanks in a way to the fact that art has this commercial aspect, I had an elevator made just now. And that changes, that makes, which is very situationist in a way, it makes that a vertical house suddenly becomes horizontal. So that makes that I could make much more work now than I did before, because I just walk on a horizontal level, if you can imagine how it is, instead of going up. Do you remember going up all the way? Okay, how I made the magazine? I made it actually because I was so furious against this exclusion of the Gruppe Spur, who at the same time, they had also a legal problem because of their magazine, because of pornographic and blasphemic, and which is not so surprising when you're in avant-garde. And they got thrown out on the moment of this horrible trial in Munich, which still had very much Nazi influence. And the Situationists threw them out. I mean, the Situationists, the Van Eyck, Kotani, and De Boer. And then I said, I'm not only me, also the Scandinavian part of the Situationists. We agreed we are going to support the German part, the Gruppe Spur. And then I used this moment to realize the magazine which I wanted to make, and I had announced 2 years before, 1.5 years before, in London when we were at the Congress at the ICA, and which I was going to give the title Situationist Times. And it never came out then, but this was the moment that I could get it out. So I started with the trial of the Spur and some other aspects. And then, well, it went on and on and on, getting more, well, I think another concept which was very much in the magazine was to have it very international, very multi-language, multi-anything, multi-image, whatever, and based on something which was made by Arthur Lening, which was called E2, sorry. And that was in the 20s, and he had all very important artists and architects and scientists in his magazine, and I wanted to do the same, and I tried to realize it. Now, and then it did.
Now, it's an extraordinary publication. We're going to talk more about some of your other books later, but I want to now talk about your painting, and you. It's always interesting, I think, where the catalogue raisonné of an artist begins, you know, because there is student work, there is the beginning, but then at a certain moment, there is the number one in the catalogue raisonné, the first work the artist considers to be, you know, part of the oeuvre. What would you say is the number one in your catalogue raisonné?
I beg your pardon?
So you see the first work where you felt this is no longer student work, but you know, you felt you had found your language. Where does your work begin?
I wouldn't know. I think you should tell. I can't. In a way, I don't know. I can't answer this really, because it all gets together, and it doesn't really, we could say it doesn't have a real start. Mm-hmm. It's a flu. It goes, it's somehow, I mean, it all has nothing to do with this works here. Does it? Does it have anything to do with what we're looking at? No one is looking at them anyway.
I think we all do. And we should talk about them, you know, more in detail, because I think it's interesting that to understand your artistic process, you actually said that you usually start from a simple fact or from a detail that you come across.
That's why it's a usual answer. I don't know. I mean, it just depends in the artistic process. At that moment, the inhaling of what is going on in the world or what is going on around you makes you start. On the other hand, practically, it is sort of like a drawing, or like whatever your mind goes into your hand. That's one other thing I said at some moment to you. It's always from there going to there, or wherever, and then you don't agree? I think you agree. She's an artist to us in a way. I think we just do it out of I can't say intuition, but just because we want to do it. And it's in the brain, and then it gets physically into the hands. No?
Yeah, and that's, I think, very true, and that's why Whistler said, art happens.
Yeah, it
Which
happens.
I always thought was a great...
Or it doesn't. It might not happen,
but it can.
And it can happen. And when you're lucky, and I don't know what is art. I mean, when is it art? What happens? Something in the creation, or in this artificial, I mean, art is artificial. Let's not forget that. It happens, but then it can be destroyed at once also. And that's where I think the sort of fluxus or atipova comes in. It's not always happening, which is so obvious as this sort of paintings. I mean, there's not much avant-garde, I would say, in this way of working, because it's very traditional. Don't you agree?
But it would be interesting because you say the way of working. That's why I was asking you about the process. So it would be interesting, when you do these paintings, do you do sketches, or how does the process work? Or do you make drawings beforehand, or is it all happening directly on
when I make drawings, Hans, then I'm making drawings. Drawings are a chapter apart. When I work on canvas, I usually make first a drawing. I don't put just a color on canvas, but I make a form, a drawing, which you can see in a way also. And that drawing makes it. I don't make sketches. I mean, I think I make sketches in my head, but I don't make sketches on paper. When I draw, they become autonomous drawings, because when you draw, it's like writing. And then you just go on and on and on, and like rules, you just want to, until you suddenly stop. But on a canvas or on another surface, I think the drawing is the essential thing, because you have to do it mainly when you work on this sort of craft paper and canvas together. You have to realize that whatever you put on is on. You can't get it away. And making sketches, I think, takes away the fun of doing it. I mean, that's why I like to make drawings as autonomous.
Yeah, there were many
stuff.
drawings in your house we saw, but the interesting thing is...
Yeah, I make lots of drawings, but they're complementary.
Yeah. Now it's interesting also because this is our first conversation. We did one at Artissima in Torino, we did one at the Pompidou about 68, May 68, and then another one, of course, in your house. So today is the first one. In our previous conversations, I was looking again at the transcripts and notes. We talked about the grotesque and about these human-animal hybrids. And of course, several here in the show. So I wanted to ask you, tell us a little bit about this and where this theme kind of comes from, where these hybrids come from.
I don't know. I have to ask you again. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. I don't know where everything comes from. It comes. It just appears. And of course, there are very specific sort of series of works which I made on the war recently. I made on the First World War and things like that, or the série noire where we were talking about it at Artissima. They are not monsters. I mean, they're not monsters. They're realistic. They're much more realistic, and they're also very often more. You could say very often they are aspects which I think I treat like monsters or things like that, which are not to be treated like that. And that's this sort of resilience of opposition I want to make in my work. I mean, also to make it more, well, to me, more interesting. Perhaps you remember what I was saying. I think it's always very important to be curious, to go on being curious. And so I force in my work the curiosity. And what I see very much with these paintings, which I haven't seen together for a long time, that even I see different aspects or different things coming out of them. And this sort of imagination and fantasy, I find some importance.
And there is also amazing titles with all these works. The works have titles. These are mostly paintings from the 80s. The painting you are all looking at, which is behind us, is called Ceux qui vont en bateau, to those who go in a boat. Can you tell us about the titles and where the titles come from?
That's something I very often try to explain. The titles, like many artists, have titles which are come from literature. And I try to use also literature or even music into the titles, because I think there has to be another aspect, not only the visual aspect, but if possible also a sort of poetic aspect which comes from words and from language again. There we go again. And that's why they are wordplays very often.
Now in this, yes?
I don't think I mean, many artists do this. I went to look at the self-portraits of, what's his name? Now I'm got out fried, Lucien Freud today. And that's exactly what I thought. They're very beautiful, and I'm very impressed, sort of. But on the other hand, I think it is self-portraits. Self-portraits, it's like, well, there is too much selfies nowadays that I don't think it's a very good moment to make a show of self-portraits in honor of Freud, who I think is a fantastic, great artist. I think it's very strange to have all these selfies because they have no fantasy. I mean, they're very well done, and they're self-portraits, yes. Thank you very much. But where is the big inspiration of Freud and many other, in portraits and nudes? There is something lacking to me in the, let's say, I'm sorry for this critic, but I still want to say it. In what makes art exciting, there has always to be an enigma, and there's very little enigma. And enigma comes from titles and interpretations of literature and music.
I was actually looking at all the titles, when I saw the show, and then looked again at the titles just now. The painting here opposite, if you look all behind, on the opposite wall of the painting we all look at, has a particularly enigmatic title. Particularly this one as well has an enigmatic title. The painting on this side here is called Bigfoot. Over there is called Bigfoot.
Small Hat.
Small Hat for Thomas. Can you tell us about Bigfoot, Small Hat for Thomas?
Well, Thomas was my late husband, and I gave the painting to him, so that's not the title. It's just on the back, and suddenly it became a title. That happens. And he didn't have big feet and small hat. But this guy, if it's a sort of person, has a very funny hat in comparison to all the other things. It's just a title. Titles are very often fun. I just give them titles. Well, I don't know. It's like you make poetry. I don't know why it's called Bigfoot and Small Hat. I hardly ever want to explain my work.
Because there are an enigma. But what we can talk about is maybe, influence. And it's interesting. Panofsky said the future is invented with fragments from the past. And there are painters from the past who inspired you, more than Freud, certainly Bacon, who is an inspiration. But you also told me, and you mentioned it also in the catalogue here, in your conversation with Elizabeth Fullerton, You mentioned these influences you told us in Torino, and it's interesting that there are quite several, English painters. There is Kitai and Hockney, and then of course Beckmann, the German painter, and Goya. Can you tell us a little bit about these painters and how they inspired you?
I think it's a bit funny in a way. I say that because I'm just thinking, I wouldn't know many French painters or Italian painters or, German painters, of course, expressionists I've been influenced by, and definitely I've been influenced in the beginning by Johan and his company, companions. But it's very much, I don't know if it's also a little bit my background, and that I got early to know the English painters of my age, like Hockney and Kitai, etc., and Blake. And I felt very familiar to them. And they have this sort of surrealist aspect, which, for example, people like James Ensor, or painters like James Ensor, the Belgium have also. There's this mixture of surrealism, which is lacking in many of my compatriots of my age, or mainly of the earlier age, although the Cobra people had it, or we decided not to mention the word Cobra, but okay.
I promised I wouldn't mention it.
You did, but I'm so sorry that I did. But anyway, the influence on surrealism, which is in the Belgian painters, and very much on the English painters, which perhaps is not so very well known, it makes this influence has influenced me, or at least has impressed me very much. On the other hand, you could say that also American artists, but that there are so many I was influenced by. But I mean, there's so many influences, and under the circumstances of having a show here, probably I put these names as the very important ones. But for Kitai, it's absolutely true. You can also, not in these works, but in the later works, you can see in the color, that one actually has to do with, definitely, with Bacon. It is, they are the absolute most important visual aspects in my work. Also, of course, with the French, there's Dubuffet, who influenced me very much. But I don't know, my generation has so many influences that I wouldn't know specifically where it starts and where it begins. My first personal influence was Nicolas de Stael, so it's not true what I'd say that I was not influenced by French. Yes, I was influenced by French. But de Stael had this color and had this material which shocked me. But that's very young, and then you get to other shocks. So I think influences go on as long as you go on making your work. So it changes.
And I also think it's always interesting to ask this question, because we then can revisit artists, and it's great that through you I actually started to look again at Kitai, who isn't so visible at the moment, and whenever I see these paintings, they are really amazing. And of course, there's a lot to do with the figures in this show. But then, what this exhibition also shows is something I knew less, which is your landscapes and dramatic landscape series. And it's interesting because I read that it was all inspired by a tiny little island called Schiermonnikoog in the north of Holland. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about the influence of this island and how it prompted these landscapes. I would love to hear more.
These landscapes are very double. That one is influenced by, and those two, by the island, because there was hunting on the island, while there was not necessity of hunting, because all the pheasants and rabbits and whatever you wanted to hunt, if you wanted to hunt, if people wanted to hunt, were just walking in front of you, so you could just grab them and you didn't have to shoot them. That I thought was very, but another thing which is very visual, at least to me it is, was with a very small plane. I went from Copenhagen to Jutland, and we passed all these yellow fields. And I thought, this is amazing. I mean, the colors of the sea and the yellow fields gave me a sort of shock. And that was the part of the dramatic landscape, because the colors were so dramatic, I thought, that I wanted to do something with them. They were at the same period, I was at this island and making with two colleagues a very big triptych. But so there's this hunting part, and the hunting part is, of course, well, they became monsters that were hunted, etc. And this very, well, landscape part, which is the sort of, well, you could say Jutland, Danish landscape, but at the same time, there's one which is Gotthard, which is the Gotthard, it's over there, which is the tunnel of the Gotthard. It's mountains, there is no really line in it. I mean, it's dramatic because the color is dramatic, let's put it that way.
That's a great answer. But then there are also the boats, and you spoke about the boats also in our previous conversations. There's a kind of an eternal return of boats. What attracts you to boats? And you also say the boats are at the same time whales.
I think boats, well, yes, they are like whales, but they're also very sexy. I don't know what is sexy about boats. I mean, I even used boats, well, I didn't use them, but I made boats which are, which is the sail on the boat. I think because it's moving, it's like dances. It's boats have something which are enigmatic. I mean, there's so many different sorts of boats, and of course, very often they're not enigmatic. But the fact that they're much more. I think they're much more interesting than aeroplanes or cars. Always fascinated me, in a way. Not any longer because of course, because of the world. We shouldn't talk about cars nowadays. But anyway, boats go on being sexy. I think they are like a womb. They are like whatever. Now they are more than boats. Boats are boats.
More than boats. That's a great answer. Now, another thing I wanted to ask you, looking, as we are looking here very intensely at your paintings, the other day I was in the studio of Gerhard Richter, and we talked about this idea when a painting is finished, and he would very often overpaint. He would destroy paintings. He would have them for a long time in the studio and test them and look at them again, and then at a certain moment completely overpaint them. I mean, famously overpaint them with another layer. And then, of course, there are other painters. The other day I visited Lynette Yadom-Boakye in her studio, and Lynette would basically do a painting in a day, and she would very rarely revisit it. It would sort of basically all happen in one day, and if it's somehow not resolved, so it's kind of very different processes. Different artists have different processes. So I wanted to ask you about that, and when do you decide that a painting is finished?
Well, there are different moments.
Yeah.
For example, a moment where I made a painting in public during a fashion show. I had to, the canvas was empty, and it was a big canvas like this. I had to be very concentrated and make the first drawing, so that I was sure it was going to be okay. Then you decide at that moment. But very often I do it in layers, and mainly nowadays, but it goes very directly. Generally, I am doing it directly, and when the first layer is okay, or the first drawing on the canvas is okay, I think you can easily go on. And when do I decide that it's definite? It's when when I feel, well, I feel okay with it. When the struggle sort of is done, and the struggle might be done at one moment, and the next day, of course, you have to struggle again. This happens. I mean, everything happens at the same time, and at sometimes it's a disaster. I mean, I'm very unhappy when it happens to be a disaster, but then destroying takes another time. Destroying something, you want to go on somehow all the time. So then again, very often it gets worse and worse and worse, and then comes the moment when you have to destroy. You have to decide, goodbye, baby. You're not well done.
Now, also in my notes from the previous conversation, I found something where you told me about something which had changed over time, that actually in your earlier work there are male and female figures, and that in the later work it's much more fluid. You say it's basically also nondescript, and that's something you say also here actually in the interview of the catalogue. In this very nice interview here with Elizabeth, you say that I don't know what they are nondescript. When did that change happen, and can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, this is of course very long ago that I made those. Now I'm only making potatoes, but these potatoes and the potato paintings, they very often turn out to be monsters. At least people see them as monsters. I don't know if there has been a change. There has been at some moment a change when I wanted to be making figurative things, figurative works, when I made a série noire, because there were interpretations on thrillers, thrillers in books. And also when I made the billiard paintings, I wanted to do it as well as possible, as good as I don't have any academic formation. I always have this challenge and always the feeling that I don't do it well enough. So these changes happen. But on the other hand, the free part, like this sort of work, which it's very gestural, what do you call it? It's very direct. There is not a change from the very beginning. The changes towards figuration gets when I get this sort of frustration. I want to do it well.
Now the potatoes are interesting because I saw many of these potatoes in your studio, and we talked about your books, and I think it's still a very underappreciated aspect of artist work are artist books. I think artist books are key for art history. If you think about Yoko Ono's Grapefruit book, yeah. And you've done a couple of truly extraordinary artist books, and I love this Potato Blues. For those of you who haven't read it, it's a very urgent book published by the One Star Press, and it's really the book where you bring together these series with the potatoes, and it's an incredible plant. I mean, Deleuze-Guattari talk about the rhizomes, of the potatoes as part of their philosophy, and you said the potato is very enigmatic. It reproduces underground, and it has flowers and seeds. Can you tell us a little bit what attracts you to the potato as a subject matter, and also if you could tell us a little bit about this masterpiece, your Potato Blues?
Well, the potato blues, or the potatoes. Anyway, this potatoes is not because it's potato, but it's under the ground. You don't know what is happening, then it comes out, and it changes. The deformation, the continual deformation fascinates me. Of course, there are lots of other things that have deformations too. But now, as I found out that you can do so many things, not only as food, you can do lots of things with potatoes, but also after food or before food. There is so much to be done that it fascinates me. It's the form, it's the transformation and the deformation and modification, which I also use in my magazine, and which I, in a way, used also in the satire book, which you quite liked, which I made together with Jan.
Yeah, which is a
has-
book I adore. That's
Yeah.
another book you all need to urgently look at. It's actually much more than a book. It's a box.
Yes, it's a box. You said a little bit like the Chance, what's it called, green box, and I mean that's again also the sort of modification of things. Although there are real things, but when they get together, when they get into another form, it's topologically deforming, and that fascinates me. And that's the same in the potato.
So the topology, yeah, the theme of the topology comes in the Situationist, comes in many of these books, and there is the knot, there is the labyrinth also, no?
Yeah, absolutely. But then there's also the pinball. And the pinball is one of the last exhibitions I made on the magazine, that's pinball issue.
That's important. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I forgot completely to ask you about the pinball, because last time we met you were preparing this retrospective at the Stedelijk, and you actually called it the Pinball Wizard. It's a show which ran until the 18th of August this year, and you said that you were in Amsterdam in the 70s compiling an archive of pinball, and that people were crazy about your pinball archive. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because you made silk screens, you made machines, you rented them. There's a whole story, an adventure, a pinball adventure.
Yes, but that really has to do with this enigma about the topology, the mathematical form, which of course was used in the Situationist times, which I can't use. I never used in paintings. You can't use it. Well, in a way, you could say billiard. A billiard has something topological, and it definitely has, because it's one form, and the ball is playing all the games on that same form. But the pinball has the same. It is within the machine that the change of the derive of the ball is doing its way, and that is fascinating, because it's changing all the time. And it is within a certain space that it's happening. So that is one part of it. And then there is something, you could say, which is erotic about playing pinball. I mean, it's funny to see people playing it. There are even keynotes made pinball machine with a man in it. I mean, there are. I'm not the only one that is fascinated by this. It's not even only a game. It's more than a. It's not really a game, because you can't win anything. You can win a free ball. That's all you can win. But the game in itself has something erotic and topological.
Now I promised actually that this will not be a marathon, because we also want to open it for your question. I have one or two last questions. I also wanted to ask, because you told us this in Amsterdam when we were visiting you, that you're also going into jewelry, potato jewelry.
Well, that's a very simple aspect of how it happened. I was just asked by a collector of artist jewelry to make jewelry for her. And there was this potato who had a very funny form, and I thought, let this potato, I'll try to get it into something like gold or so, then it gets real jewelry. But then it started with that one. And then suddenly, because she liked that one, she wanted more. And then I said, I'm going to use all my potatoes which have all these sprouts and which have all these deformations, and have them put into gold or platina so that they become jewelry. And then suddenly there was the Pomme de Jong, who is jewelry. So, but all these things, I'm wearing one, Pippy's wearing one, each one is just only a potato. There's no more about it. A potato is potato sprouts. These are sprouts, and this is the potato. I don't know why they are really called jewelry, because, well, I just recently, in an exhibition, had them without anything on them, so they are objects. And to me, they are actually objects to wear, you could say.
And then there are also the potato paintings.
Oh yeah, and then, yes, then we have the potato paintings, and the potato paintings come out of this little book you mentioned, because they are photos that I used on, I blew up on the canvas, and then I painted on them. But now I put also potatoes inside them. So I think now I should stop with the potatoes.
But it's actually a potato language. You said that you called it last time a potato language because it reminded, it sort of connects maybe also to the Inca knot language in a way. No, it's a potato language.
Because that was the thread language, which they were, the knot language, which I already, I think, 63 used in the magazine, which is an Inca language, which they were on threads having knots, and that was the way they were talking to each other. I mean, they were communicating. And so my first use of potatoes, I used in an exhibition with Jennifer T, and I had the mashed potato language. And then there was also the potato hair, and that is very long sprouts. I only use it once in painting.
Yeah, because they grow, you told me also when we were in your house and we saw the potatoes, that there are actually many more potatoes in weird shapes and crazy long sprouts in your house in France. It's like the house in France seems to be a potato laboratory, no?
Well, it's yes, sort of. I mean, it's very difficult to grow in a house in Amsterdam, to grow potatoes. I could try, but I didn't until now. I was going to do it when I was nominated for the Biennale in Venice, to do it around the pavilion, to have potatoes growing. And I thought then we have a potato meal also. Hans Ulrich, we really decided to do that. But then I was only nominated, I didn't get the pavilion. So, no, I have to do them in France because there is space to have them grown. But for example, this summer, last summer, I didn't get any potatoes out. I only got very few. So that makes that when I have a show now, we'll have a show in Wils in Belgium, I cannot make the installation, which I would like to make with the potatoes, which I made in Amsterdam at the One Work exhibition. And you know very well the space. And I have no potatoes. And I have to have my own potatoes because they are on color. It's the color of the potatoes that count to make an installation, because it's color.
So what's then the installation at One Work?
Well, at One Work there was an installation.
Yeah.
It was a round thing, or just starting a circle with potatoes. It was very dark potatoes, and they were from last year, but this year there's no potatoes. It was too warm to have potatoes.
Now a very last question, and you already took us to this theme, which is, your Unrealized Pavilion for Venice with the potatoes. As you know, I'm very interested in unrealized projects, and we know a great deal about architects' unrealized projects because they publish them all the time, and they also have competitions, and then they publish unrealized projects for competitions. And ultimately, utopic architecture gets kind of built often by relentless publishing of unrealized projects until it finally, gets realized. Whilst in art we know nothing about artists' unrealized projects. So Alighiero Boetti, when I was a student, went to see him, he advised me, to ask artists about their unrealized projects, because when we know about it, we can maybe help to realize them. And he also said that very often, artists are always invited to do the same thing, exhibitions and sometimes biennales and public artworks, but very often artists want to do other things, and outside that box, maybe more utopic projects, bigger projects. I wanted to ask you, and then can also be projects which are too small to be realized, or self-censored projects. Doris Lessing said, there are projects we don't dare to do. So there's, of course, censorship, projects we are not allowed to do, but then there's also projects we simply don't dare to do. That's Doris Lessing called that self-censorship. So there's a whole roster of why projects are unrealized. Can you tell us, besides the pavilion you already described, maybe about some or one of your dream projects, unrealized projects, utopias?
I could go back to the Situationist project, which is one project I regret very much, that we never, that I say we never realized. I wouldn't know really a project I didn't realize, because I always try to realize the project, even if it's decades later than when it was, well, like the book, the Sartre book, was a project we had, Jan and I had together in '62, and it wasn't realized 5 years ago. But the Situationist project, which was never realized, was the Sitocratic town or island which we were going to make. And that was an island where you could build, it was going to be a Sitocratic society, so lots of détournements and dérives, and lots of very utopian ways of shaping this society, but also in the construction, in the urbanism, the idea was that buildings were constructed and streets were constructed in sort of materials that you could get them down and deform them, even once they were standing. So a completely moving sort of town or island. And that never was realized. I wonder why it wasn't realized. But probably, actually the same Marinotti was going to pay for it. But then, of course, there was the struggle between the bar and the others. But I regretted that it could have been a sort of chewing gum society, or gum at least, if not, we didn't have to chew in it, but it had to deform, and I think that would be very nice. We could talk it over with Rem Koolhaas.
I think
it would be an idea, yeah.
I'm going to call him tonight. Yeah, I think
absolutely.
Great idea.
Let's
now
finish on that. That's a new project we could do.
This is why we're talking
So
about it.
Unrealized project.
Make it happen. Very exciting. Then one very last question is, I see several young artists here, and I always think it's interesting. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote this little book, which is an advice to a young poet. So I was kind of wondering, Jacqueline, what in 2019 would be your advice to a young artist, to a young painter?
I think the same advice I told you before. Should I say it in Swiss?
Ja, absolutely.
Absolutely. Blieb neugierig.
Blieb neugierig ist ein wunderbares, das ist auch ein großartiges Schlusswort. Ja,
you have to bleib neugierig.
Für immer, oder? Ewige Neugier, ja.
Neugier. Being, well, you translate it.
What Jacqueline told us is that in Swiss German, is that the advice to a young artist is stay curious. Jacqueline, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.